June 23rd, 1944, Belarusia. 3 o'clock in the morning, the forest explodes. Not metaphorically, literally. Trees disintegrate into splinters. Earth erupts in geysers of soil and fire. The sound isn't thunder. It's 120,000 Soviet artillery pieces firing simultaneously across a front stretching 400 kilometers from the Pripyat marshes to the Baltic approaches. The barrage is so intense that German soldiers, 50 kilometers behind the front lines, feel the ground shake beneath their bunkers. Obergefreiter Klaus Becker, manning a listening post near Vitebsk, crouches in his trench as the world ends around him. He's 19. He's been on the Eastern Front for 11 months. He thought he'd seen artillery before, but this is different. This is apocalypse made systematic. Industrial annihilation coordinated to the second across hundreds of kilometers. The bombardment lasts 2 hours. When it stops, the silence is somehow worse than the noise. Becker peers over the parapet. The forest that surrounded his position yesterday no longer exists. Just blackened stumps and smoke so thick it looks like fog. Then he hears the engines. Thousands of them, T-34s rolling forward through the devastation, infantry following in waves that seem endless. The Red Army isn't probing. It's smashing through with overwhelming force, and Becker's division, under strength, undermanned, commanded by officers still planning for yesterday's war, has perhaps hours before it ceases to exist. This is Operation Bagration, the Soviet summer offensive of 1944. It will destroy 28 German divisions in 5 weeks, kill or capture over 500,000 Wehrmacht soldiers, and shatter German defensive positions that took 3 years to build. It's the single largest defeat in German military history, eclipsing even Stalingrad in scope and devastation. And it begins here in the pre-dawn darkness of June 23rd with forests burning and soldiers realizing, too late, that everything they've been told about Soviet capabilities is catastrophically wrong. Before we continue, if you enjoy cinematic deep dives into history like this, please consider subscribing. It really helps us bring forgotten stories to life. To understand why Operation Bagration succeeded so completely, you have to rewind 18 months to the winter of 1942, when Germany's Eastern strategy began its long collapse. Stalingrad falls in February 1943. The German Sixth Army, once 300,000 strong, surrenders. It's a psychological shock as much as a military disaster. German armies aren't supposed to be encircled and destroyed. German soldiers aren't supposed to surrender by the tens of thousands. But they have, and the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility dies in the Volgograd snow. The Soviets press their advantage. They launch Operation Little Saturn, driving German forces back across the Don. Then come offensives in the Caucasus, recapturing Rostov. By spring 1943, the front lines have shifted hundreds of kilometers westward, and Germany faces a strategic problem with no good solutions. The Wehrmacht is overextended. From Leningrad in the north to the Crimea in the south, German forces hold a front line stretching over 2,400 kilometers. Garrison duties, occupation forces, and defensive positions consume divisions that are needed for offensive operations, and offensive operations are needed desperately. Hitler remains convinced that attacking is the only way to regain initiative. July 1943. Operation Citadel, the Battle of Kursk, Germany's last major offensive in the east. Hitler concentrates nearly 1 million men and over 2,700 tanks for a double envelopment of the Kursk salient. If successful, it will encircle Soviet forces, shorten German defensive lines, and demonstrate that the Wehrmacht can still achieve decisive victories. German generals have doubts. Soviet defenses at Kursk are formidable, but Hitler insists. The offensive begins July 5th. Within days, it's clear the operation has failed. Soviet defenses are deeper and stronger than intelligence suggested. German tank losses are catastrophic. Soviet counterattacks begin before the Wehrmacht can achieve breakthrough. By July 23rd, the offensive is called off. Germany has lost over 200,000 men and 700 tanks for minimal territorial gains. Kursk marks the end of German strategic offensive capability. From this point forward, the Wehrmacht is fighting a defensive war, trying to hold territory, delay Soviet advances, trade space for time. But the space keeps shrinking and the time keeps running out. The Red Army, meanwhile, is transforming. The force that barely survived 1941 is gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. Soviet tactics have evolved: massed artillery, combined arms operations, deep battle doctrine that seeks not just to defeat enemy formations but to annihilate them through encirclement. Soviet equipment has improved. T-34 tanks now arrive with trained crews, radios, and doctrine for exploiting breakthroughs. Soviet leadership has adapted. Stalin no longer interferes tactically, allowing commanders like Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Konev to exercise operational creativity. By spring 1944, the Red Army is preparing its next offensive, not where the Germans expect, not in Ukraine, where fighting has raged since winter, but in Belarusia against Army Group Center. Army Group Center has been sitting in defensive positions since autumn 1943. It's commanded by Field Marshal Ernst Busch, a competent but unimaginative officer loyal to Hitler. The army group consists of roughly 800,000 men organized into 4 armies, spread across Belarusia in a front bulging eastward towards Smolensk. German defensive doctrine calls for fortified positions in depth, with mobile reserves positioned to counterattack Soviet penetrations. Busch believes his positions are strong. The terrain favors defense: forests, marshes, rivers that channelize attacker movement. His troops occupy fortified towns and strongpoints designated as fortresses by Hitler, places that must be held at all costs. The most important of these are Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk, anchor points of the entire defensive system. Intelligence reports suggest Soviet forces opposite Army Group Center have been reinforced, but German assessments conclude any offensive will come in Ukraine, where terrain is better suited for armored operations. Belarusia, with its swamps and forests, seems an unlikely axis for major attack. This assessment is catastrophically wrong. May 1944, Soviet High Command finalizes plans for Operation Bagration, named after Prince Pyotr Bagration, a Russian general killed fighting Napoleon in 1812. The symbolism is deliberate. This operation will drive German forces from Soviet soil, just as Bagration fought to expel French invaders 132 years earlier. The plan is elegant and brutal. 4 Soviet fronts: 1st Baltic, 3rd Belarusian, 2nd Belarusian, and 1st Belarusian will attack simultaneously across Belarusia. The primary objectives are the German-held fortress cities, which will be encircled and isolated. Once German forces are tied down defending these cities, Soviet mobile groups will exploit gaps, driving deep into German rear areas and creating massive encirclements. The operation will employ 2.3 million Soviet troops, 5,200 tanks, 5,300 aircraft, and over 30,000 artillery pieces. It's the largest concentration of Soviet military power yet assembled for a single operation. Deception is critical. Soviet Maskirovka, military deception, convinces German intelligence the main offensive will come in Ukraine. Fake radio traffic, dummy tank formations, and carefully controlled information leaks all reinforce the deception. Meanwhile, actual preparations for Bagration occur under strict security. Troop movements happen at night. Radio silence is maintained. Units move to assembly areas in forests where German reconnaissance can't observe them. By mid-June, over 1 million Soviet soldiers are positioned opposite Army Group Center. German intelligence estimates Soviet strength at perhaps half that number. The actual correlation of forces is overwhelming. In artillery alone, the Soviets have a 7-to-1 advantage. In tanks and aircraft, the ratios are similar. Army Group Center, unaware of the storm gathering, continues routine operations. Some units are being withdrawn and sent to France. The Allies landed at Normandy on June 6th, and Germany desperately needs reinforcements in the west. Field Marshal Busch protests losing divisions, but Hitler insists. The Führer believes Belorussia is quiet. Stalin is content to let him believe it. If you're still watching, you're clearly a history lover. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next story. June 22nd, 1944, the third anniversary of Operation Barbarossa, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. Soviet partisan forces behind German lines launch coordinated sabotage operations. Railway lines are demolished. Supply depots explode. Communication cables are cut. These aren't random attacks. They're precisely timed to disrupt German logistics and communications just as the offensive begins. German commanders receive reports of increased partisan activity but interpret it as routine. Army Group Center's headquarters in Minsk processes intelligence suggesting Soviet offensive preparations but concludes nothing is imminent. Field Marshal Busch is confident his defenses will hold. At 1900 hours, June 22nd, Soviet reconnaissance units probe German forward positions. These aren't full attacks, just testing raids to identify defensive positions and weak points. German troops repel them easily, confirming their belief that Soviet forces aren't ready for major operations. At 0400 hours, June 23rd, the artillery barrage begins. It's not like previous Soviet bombardments. This is systematic annihilation, counter-battery fire targeting German artillery positions, suppression fire on defensive strongpoints, and interdiction fire on communication nodes and supply routes. German forward positions simply cease to exist under the weight of shells. Fortifications designed to withstand attack collapse. Bunkers cave in. Trenches become mass graves. The German command system fragments immediately. Telephone lines are cut. Radio communications are jammed or destroyed. Forward units can't report to headquarters. Headquarters can't issue orders to frontline troops. Within the first hour, Army Group Center's command and control effectively ceases to function. At 0600 hours, the barrage shifts. Soviet artillery concentrates on specific breakthrough sectors whilst infantry and tanks roll forward into gaps blown through German defenses. The assault waves advance methodically, not charging recklessly but moving in coordinated bounds. Infantry clearing positions whilst tanks provide fire support. German defenders, dazed and disoriented from 2 hours of bombardment, offer patchy resistance. Some strong points fight fiercely, others collapse immediately. The line doesn't break uniformly, it shatters into fragments. Isolated defensive positions surrounded by Soviet forces that flow past them like water around stones. By midday, June 23rd, Soviet forces have penetrated German defenses to depths of 15 to 20 kilometers along multiple axes. The 3rd Belarusian Front smashes into 3rd Panzer Army north of Vitebsk. The 1st Baltic Front drives toward the city from the northeast. Within hours, Vitebsk is encircled, cutting off over 35,000 German troops. Similar disasters unfold across the front. Near Orsha, The Second Belarusian Front breaches German lines and begins pushing toward Mogilev in the south. The First Belarusian Front overwhelms defensive positions protecting Bobruisk, encircling another 40,000 German soldiers. Field Marshal Busch, receiving fragmentary reports, still doesn't grasp the scale of catastrophe unfolding. He believes these are local penetrations that reserves can contain. He orders fortress cities to hold at all costs, Hitler's standing directive, and expects the situation to stabilize within days. It doesn't stabilize, it accelerates. June 24th, Soviet mobile groups exploit the breakthroughs. Tank corps and mechanized cavalry divisions pour through gaps in German defenses, driving westward at speeds that German commanders thought impossible through Belarusian terrain. The forests and marshes that were supposed to channel attackers become concealment for Soviet advances that bypass German strongpoints entirely. German commanders request permission to withdraw from encircled positions. Busch forwards the requests to Hitler. Hitler refuses. The fortress cities must be held. Withdrawal is forbidden. Units that abandon positions without orders will be court-martialed for cowardice. So the encircled garrisons stay and die. Vitebsk falls June 27th after 5 days of encirclement. The 35,000 German troops trapped there are killed or captured. Similar fates befall Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk over the following days. Entire divisions cease to exist, not routed, not defeated in battle, but systematically destroyed through encirclement and annihilation. By the end of June, Army Group Center has lost over 200,000 men. The front line that existed a week earlier is gone. Soviet forces have advanced over 200 kilometers in some sectors, liberating Minsk, capital of Belarusia, on July 3rd. German defensive positions that were supposed to hold until winter have collapsed in days. And the offensive isn't slowing, it's gathering momentum. What Operation Bagration achieved in its first week was unprecedented in military history. Not just the scale of destruction, but the speed and coordination. The Red Army didn't just break through German lines, it systematically destroyed Army Group Center's ability to function as a military formation. Command structures collapsed, supply lines were severed, retreat routes were cut. German units found themselves fighting isolated battles whilst Soviet forces flowed past them, advancing toward objectives hundreds of kilometers behind the supposed front lines. German soldiers, caught in encirclements, faced impossible choices: obey Hitler's orders and stay in position, guaranteeing death or captivity, attempt breakouts which might succeed but meant abandoning equipment, wounded comrades and facing court-martial if caught, or surrender, accepting Soviet POW camps where survival rates were grim. Most tried to break out. Small groups, sometimes entire battalions, attempted to fight their way westward through Soviet positions. Some succeeded, emerging exhausted and decimated to find German lines that no longer existed. Most were captured or killed. One account from a German lieutenant describes the breakout from Bobruisk. We moved at night, avoiding roads, staying in forests. Soviet patrols were everywhere. We'd hear engines, hide, wait for tanks to pass. Twice we walked into Soviet infantry camps by accident, just stumbled onto them in darkness. The chaos saved us. They didn't expect Germans behind their lines. We killed sentries, scattered, regrouped a kilometer away. Of 200 men who started the breakout, 30 reached German lines. We'd walked 100 kilometers in 6 days. When we arrived, the unit we'd hoped to rejoin had been destroyed 3 days earlier. And if you're enjoying this deep dive, a quick reminder, subscribing helps us keep making stories like this every week. July 1944, the offensive continues far beyond its initial objectives. Soviet planners anticipated advancing perhaps 150 kilometers, liberating Belarusia, destroying significant German forces. What actually happens exceeds every expectation. By mid-July, Soviet forces have advanced over 600 kilometers in some sectors. They've crossed the pre-war Soviet-Polish border. They're approaching the Vistula River and East Prussia, German territory. Army Group Center, as a coherent formation, no longer exists. Of the 38 divisions that began the month, 28 have been completely destroyed. Over 500,000 German soldiers are dead, captured, or missing. Equipment losses are catastrophic. Thousands of artillery pieces, vehicles, and small arms abandoned as units disintegrated. Hitler finally acts. He sacks Field Marshal Busch, replacing him with Field Marshal Model, a defensive specialist known for stabilizing collapsing fronts. Model arrives to find not a front, but a catastrophe. German units are scattered across hundreds of kilometers. Soviet advances have created massive salients that threaten to encircle entire army groups. The strategic situation is beyond stabilization. It requires miracle working. Model doesn't have miracles. What he has is authority to make the decisions Busch wasn't allowed to make. He authorizes withdrawals from untenable positions. He scrapes together reserves from other sectors, stripping defensive positions elsewhere to create mobile fire brigades. He establishes new defensive lines far to the west, accepting territorial losses to preserve what forces remain. Slowly, agonizingly, the German retreat begins to stabilize. Not because Soviet attacks weaken, they don't, but because supply lines stretch. Soviet units outrun their logistics, and the offensive's momentum naturally decays as forces advance hundreds of kilometers from starting positions. By August, Operation Bagration concludes. Soviet forces have pushed the front line westward by an average of 600 kilometers across the entire central sector. Belarusia is liberated. Soviet armies stand on the borders of East Prussia, threatening Germany itself. And Army Group Center, once the largest German formation in the east, has been virtually annihilated. The offensive's success is so complete that German strategic positions across the entire Eastern Front become untenable. Army groups north and south, which weren't directly attacked, must withdraw to avoid being outflanked by Soviet forces that have driven so deeply westward. The entire German defensive system in the east collapses like a structure with its central pillar removed. The human cost of Operation Bagration is difficult to fully comprehend. German casualties exceed 500,000 killed, wounded, captured. Entire divisions vanish from order of battle. Units that began June with 10,000 men finish August with 500. 70 German generals are killed or captured during the offensive, including multiple corps and army commanders. It's a decapitation of German command structure that can't be replaced. Soviet casualties are also severe. Over 180,000 killed, perhaps 600,000 wounded. But the Red Army can absorb these losses. Soviet reserves, industrial production, and numerical superiority mean losses are replaced within weeks. For Germany, each casualty is irreplaceable. There are no reserves. The Wehrmacht is hollowed out, its combat power declining with each offensive. Whilst Soviet capabilities grow, the psychological impact on German soldiers is profound. Many had believed, despite setbacks, that Germany could still achieve stalemate, hold defensive lines, exhaust Soviet offensives. Bagration shatters that belief. Soviet forces have demonstrated operational sophistication and material superiority that makes continued resistance feel futile. Letters home from German soldiers in summer 1944 reflect this despair. One Gefreiter writes to his father, "We no longer fight to win. We fight because Stopping means prison camps in Siberia. The Ivans are everywhere, always stronger, always more numerous. Our officers tell us to hold, but holding is dying slowly instead of quickly. I don't know which is worse. Civilian impact is equally devastating. As Soviet forces advance through Belarusia, they liberate territories occupied by Germany since 1941. What they find confirms the worst atrocities, mass graves, destroyed villages, evidence of systematic extermination of Jewish populations. The German occupation has been genocidal, and as Soviet forces push westward, the desire for revenge intensifies. German civilians in East Prussia begin fleeing westward, aware that Soviet armies are approaching and terrified of reprisals. The roads fill with refugees, women, children, elderly, abandoning homes that have been German for centuries. They're fleeing not just military defeat, but historical reckoning, and most will never return. Operation Bagration's strategic consequences ripple across the entire Second World War. The destruction of Army Group Center forces Germany to strip forces from other theaters. Divisions that should reinforce Normandy after D-Day instead go east, trying to stabilize the collapsing front. This weakens German positions in France, accelerating Allied breakout from Normandy and the liberation of Paris. In the Balkans, Romania, watching Soviet forces drive toward its borders, begins secret negotiations to switch sides. Finland similarly opens talks to exit the war. Germany's remaining allies recognize that the Reich is losing and begin planning for post-war survival. Inside Germany, the July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler occurs partly because Wehrmacht officers recognize the war is lost and hope regime change might salvage negotiated peace. The attempt fails, leading to purges of German officer corps that further weaken military effectiveness. The Red Army's advance creates the strategic conditions for the war's end. By autumn 1944, Soviet forces are positioned to invade Germany itself, to drive toward Berlin, to achieve total victory. The question is no longer whether Germany will lose, but how quickly and at what cost. For the soldiers who survived Bagration, the trauma is permanent. German veterans describe the offensive in terms usually reserved for natural disasters, the catastrophe, the collapse, the end. It's not remembered as a battle, but as annihilation, the moment when military resistance became futile and survival became the only goal. Soviet veterans remember it differently, as vindication. After 3 years of brutal combat, retreats, encirclements, and catastrophic losses, the Red Army has demonstrated it can not just match but overwhelm the Wehrmacht. Operation Bagration is proof that Soviet military transformation is complete, that the desperate defensive army of 1941 has become an offensive juggernaut, capable of destroying German formations with systematic efficiency. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person we make these videos for. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Why did Operation Bagration succeed so completely? The immediate answer points to Soviet operational excellence. Superior planning, deception, concentration of force, exploitation of breakthrough, all true. And the Red Army in 1944 was executing combined arms operations at a level the Wehrmacht could no longer match. But the deeper answer involves German strategic bankruptcy. Army Group Center's defensive positions weren't weak because of incompetence. They were weak because Germany no longer had the resources to defend everywhere. The Wehrmacht was fighting a two-front war. After D-Day, facing strategic bombing that destroyed industrial capacity, coping with manpower shortages as casualties accumulated faster than replacements arrived, Hitler's insistence on holding fortress cities, refusing withdrawals, prioritizing symbolic over strategic objectives, all of it contributed to the catastrophe. Flexible defense might have traded space for time, preserving forces whilst delaying Soviet advances. Instead, German divisions were tied to indefensible positions and destroyed piecemeal. The fortress city doctrine reveals Hitler's fundamental misunderstanding of modern warfare. He believed willpower could substitute for military capability, that ordering positions held would somehow make them holdable. This worked occasionally, determined defenders inflicting disproportionate casualties on attackers. But against an enemy with overwhelming material superiority and operational sophistication, static defense just concentrated forces for systematic annihilation. Bagration also exposed the limits of German military professionalism. Wehrmacht officers prided themselves on tactical excellence, initiative, and battlefield improvisation, but none of that compensated for strategic failure. When Hitler made catastrophically bad decisions, no retreats, hold at all costs, German officers either obeyed or faced execution. The professionalism that made the Wehrmacht effective became a trap, subordinating judgment to loyalty even when loyalty meant death. Walk through Belarusia today and you'll find monuments. Not German ones, those were removed long ago, but Soviet memorials marking battles, liberations, mass graves. They're everywhere, reminders that this territory was fought over, occupied, devastated, then liberated at enormous cost. Near Vitebsk, a monument marks where 35,000 German soldiers were encircled and destroyed. It doesn't glorify their deaths. It simply states facts, dates, units, casualties. The inscription is in Russian and Belarusian, not German. There's no audience for German remembrance here. The Wehrmacht came as occupiers, implemented genocidal policies, and died trying to hold territory they'd stolen. Sympathy is limited. For German survivors, Bagration remains largely forgotten, overshadowed by more famous battles, by Stalingrad's symbolism, by the fall of Berlin. German post-war historical memory focused on the Western Front, on defensive battles that could be framed as tragic but honorable. Bagration fits neither narrative. It was collapse, annihilation. The moment when the Wehrmacht's destruction became inevitable. Soviet and Russian historiography celebrates Bagration as revenge perfectly executed, the Red Army, repaying 1941's catastrophes by destroying German forces with the same systematic brutality Germany had shown in the war's opening. It's remembered as proof that Soviet military science, Soviet determination, and Soviet sacrifice achieved justice. The truth, as always, is more complicated. Operation Bagration was a military masterpiece, planning, deception, execution, all performed at the highest level. It was also a meat grinder that killed hundreds of thousands, displaced millions, and left scars across territories that took decades to heal. June 23rd, 1944, Belarusia. 3 o'clock in the morning, the forest explodes. Obergefreiter Klaus Becker crouches in his trench, feeling the earth shake, watching trees disintegrate into splinters. He's 19. He thinks this is just another Soviet attack, fierce but survivable. He doesn't know yet that his division will cease to exist within 3 days, that Army Group Center is being destroyed in the largest military disaster in German history, that the Eastern Front he's defending is collapsing in real time. When the barrage stops and he hears the engines, thousands of T-34s rolling forward through smoke and devastation, he still believes German reserves will stabilize the situation, that reinforcements will arrive, that the fortress cities will hold, that somehow Impossibly, Germany can still prevent defeat. He's wrong about all of it. Within a week, Becker will be captured near Minsk, beginning a journey to Soviet POW camps that will last years. Most of his comrades won't survive that long. The division he fought with, 15,000 men in June, will have 200 violent survivors by August. And Army Group Center, the formation that was supposed to anchor Germany's eastern front, will be annihilated so completely that future historians will struggle to explain how such catastrophic collapse was even possible. Operation Bagration wasn't just a battle. It was the moment when German strategic defense became impossible, when the war's outcome became undeniable, when soldiers on both sides realized that Berlin would fall, and the only question was when. The forest burns, the tanks advance, and Klaus Becker, crouching in his trench with artillery shells still raining down, doesn't yet understand that he's witnessing the beginning of the end, not just of Army Group Center, not just of Germany's hopes in the East, but of the Reich itself. Within a year, Soviet forces will be in Berlin. Within 15 months, the war in Europe will be over, and the Operation Bagration, the offensive that shattered German defenses, destroyed 28 divisions and advanced the front line 600 kilometers in 6 weeks, will be remembered as the moment when the Eastern Front didn't just bend or crack, but collapsed entirely, bringing down with it any remaining illusion that Germany could avoid total defeat. The artillery stops, the engines grow louder, and history, patient and inexorable, rolls forward through the smoke. If this story moved you or made you think differently about history, please share it. These are the stories that deserve to be remembered, not because they're heroic, but because they're human, and we'll see you in the next one.